The heavy door of the black sedan hadn't even latched when Kaito Blackwood felt it. Not the cold steel of a barrel, but the dry, crinkled texture of paper against his palm. He looked down, his sharp, weathered features tightening. It wasn't an envelope of tribute or a legal brief. It was 3 single US dollar bills, folded with trembling precision. Standing before him was a girl who looked like a shadow in her simple black dress, her light brown ponytail neat despite the chaos of the district. "Please," she whispered, her voice a calm, terrifying contrast to the sirens in the distance. "They said you're the only one who doesn't look away." His shadow enforcers converged instantly, hands reaching for concealed holsters, but Kaito raised a single, tattooed hand. The movement was absolute. His men froze. In this city, people paid Kaito in territories in silence, never in pocket change. Kaito crouched, the silk of his tailored suit brushing the grime of the sidewalk until he was eye level with the child. $3, Hana?" he asked, his voice like grinding stones. "That's a heavy price for a girl your size." She didn't flinch. She leaned in, her small hand cupping her mouth to shield her words from the wind. "The police told me my sister was collateral damage," she breathed into his ear. "But I know where Ruji took her, and I know why the precinct stopped looking." Kaito stayed frozen, the blood in his veins turning to ice. He looked at her bruised knuckles, then at the $3 in his hand, the most expensive contract he had ever been offered. "Stay with me until the end, because the request this little girl made next would trigger a scorched earth war that changed the city's skyline forever." Before we dive into the night of Black Rain, make sure to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment below with your favorite noir thriller. Now let's begin. Kaito's presence alone was enough to alter the gravity of the sidewalk. As he stepped away from the girl for a moment, the evening crowd of the Ginza district instinctively parted like a dark sea. Businessmen in rumpled suits suddenly found interest in the window displays of closed boutiques, and street vendors lowered their eyes, their voices dying in their throats. They didn't just fear the man. They feared the silence he carried with him. To look at Kaito Blackwood was to acknowledge the invisible machinery of the city, the cold, clockwork soul of an underworld that ran on the rule of control. For Kaito, the city was a map of calculated risks and balanced ledgers. Every alleyway was a vein, every transaction a heartbeat, and as long as the rhythm remained steady, he remained indifferent. He had spent 15 years perfecting this emotional sterility, transforming himself from a street-level enforcer into a sovereign of shadows. He believed that power wasn't found in the pull of a trigger, but in the ability to decide whose life was relevant and whose was merely noise. To him, the missing and the broken were usually just the price of doing business, the friction that kept the gears of the greater machine turning. His headquarters, a monolith of glass and obsidian rising above the neon haze, served as the throne for this philosophy. From his top-floor sanctuary, Kaito watched the lights of the city with the detached gaze of a god. He had built his empire on the promise of stability. He suppressed the chaotic, messy violence of petty gangs to ensure his clean operations could flourish. He was the barrier between the citizens and the true monsters, but in doing so, he had become a statue of ice. He looked down at the $3 bills still gripped between his tattooed fingers. They felt heavier than the millions he moved through offshore accounts. They represented a variable he hadn't accounted for, a pure, unadulterated hope that didn't care about treaties or territorial boundaries. Hana had approached the one man who had spent his entire life learning how not to care, and with a single whisper, she had jammed the gears of his perfect machine. The dragon's domain was no longer a fortress of ironclad logic. It was a kingdom under siege by a memory he thought he had buried under layers of silk and blood. Kaito didn't move. He remained crouched, his expensive trousers dusting the gray concrete, his eyes locked onto the small, steady girl who had dared to interrupt his orbit. The $3 sat between them like a formal contract on a mahogany desk. He watched her carefully, looking for the telltale flicker of a lie or the rehearsed tremor of a grifter, but he found only a hollow, crystalline grief. "Tell me," Kaito said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to silence the distant hum of traffic. "Tell me who took her." Hana took a shallow breath, her fingers twisting a loose thread on her black dress. "Men with red snakes on their necks," she began, her voice small but remarkably clear. "They came at dusk, when the streetlights were still flickering. They didn't kick the door down. They had a key. They took Aiko while she was making tea, and they didn't even turn off the stove." Kaito's eyes narrowed. The Ruji Syndicate. They were the scavengers of the underworld, a group that lacked the Yakuza's ancient discipline, preferring the chaotic profit of human trafficking and erasing those who couldn't fight back. They were the shadow within his shadow, a growing rot he had previously deemed too insignificant to risk a gang war over. "I went to the precinct," Hana continued, and for the first time, her voice cracked. "I sat on the plastic chairs for 6 hours. I had Aiko's picture, the one from her graduation. I told the man behind the glass that the red snakes took her. He didn't even look up from his computer. He told me girls like Aiko go away all the time. He said she probably ran off with a boyfriend and that I should go home before I got into trouble for loitering." She looked at Kaito then, her fair skin pale under the harsh neon glow of a nearby billboard. "He was wearing a gold watch, Mr. Blackwood, a watch that cost more than our apartment. And on his desk, there was a lighter with a red snake etched into the metal. That's when I knew the police weren't just busy. They were gone." The weight of her words settled into the cool night air. Kaito felt a familiar, cold pressure behind his ribs. He had built this city on the idea that order was more important than justice. But hearing the clinical indifference of the law made his own rule of control feel like a gilded cage. The police were no longer the keepers of the peace. They were the janitors for the Ruji, sweeping the collateral damage under the rug so the elite could walk on clean floors. He looked at her bruised knuckles again, the result of her trying to hold on to a doorframe or perhaps a desperate, futile strike at a uniformed officer who had tried to shove her out of the station. She was offering him $3 to do what the entire machinery of the state refused to do. To Kaito, the money was a pittance, but the truth behind it was a debt he hadn't realized he owed his city. The neon lights above flickered, casting rhythmic pulses of violet and crimson over Hana's face, and for a heartbeat, the street disappeared. Kaito wasn't standing on a rain-slicked Tokyo sidewalk anymore. He was back in a cramped, drafty apartment in the northern slums, 30 years younger, watching a pair of small, trembling hands clutch a threadbare blanket. His own sister, Eri, had possessed that same quiet gravity, that refusal to break even when the world was shattering around her. She had been the one person who saw the boy behind the scars, the one who believed his hands were meant for something other than violence. When the debt collectors had come for their father, Kaito had been too small, too weak, and too slow. He had watched her vanish into a black van, her scream cut short by a sliding door. He had spent the next 3 decades building an empire of control so that he would never feel that particular brand of helplessness again. But in the process, he had built a tomb for his own soul. He looked at Hana now, seeing the same curve of the jaw, the same defiant light in the eyes that Eri had carried until the end. The resemblance wasn't just physical. It was an echo of a ghost he had tried to drown in expensive scotch and blood-stained ledgers. For years, Kaito had told himself that his rule of control was a shield for the city, but standing before this child, he realized it was actually a shroud. He had traded his humanity for a throne, and in doing so, he had become the very thing he once hated, a man who watched from a distance while the innocent were erased. The $3 in his hand suddenly felt white-hot, searing through the leather of his gloves. The ice he had carefully cultivated around his heart, the frozen barrier that allowed him to negotiate with monsters and ignore the cries of the weak, began to spiderweb with cracks. It was a terrifying sensation, a sudden rush of warmth that felt like a wound opening. He had spent so long being a predator that he had forgotten what it felt like to be a protector. Hana didn't look away. She waited with a patience that was far too heavy for a child her age, her silence a mirror reflecting Kaito's own shadowed history. He realized then that he couldn't let the Ruji Syndicate take Aiko, not because of the money, and not even because of the breach in his territory. He couldn't let them take her because, in this small girl's plea, he had been offered a second chance to answer a scream he had failed to hear 30 years ago. The ghost of Eri wasn't asking for revenge. She was asking for a rescue. Kaito closed his fist around the crumpled bills, the paper crunching softly. The dragon was no longer just a title or a tattoo. It was a fire waking up in his chest, hungry and cold. He looked up at his men, his expression shifting from a mask of stone to something far more dangerous, a man with a purpose. Kaito climbed back into the darkened sanctuary of his sedan, the $3 pressed flat against the polished walnut of the interior armrest. Behind him, the girl remained on the sidewalk, a small, solitary figure quickly swallowed by the neon-drenched fog. Inside the car, the air was thick with the scent of expensive leather and the unspoken anxiety of his inner circle. "Sir," began Kenji, his longest-serving advisor, his voice tight with a caution that bordered on fear. "The Ruji Syndicate has 3 shipyards and the silent backing of the 4th Precinct. We signed the Treaty of the Grey Docks specifically to avoid a kinetic conflict with them. If we move on their holding cells for a single civilian, we aren't just breaking a contract. We are inviting a scorched earth war into the heart of our territory." Kaito didn't look at him. He watched the rain begin to streak the window, distorting the city lights into jagged smears of gold. He knew the arithmetic of the underworld better than anyone. A war would disrupt the supply lines, alienate the silent investors, and turn the streets he spent years stabilizing into a graveyard. On paper, the life of one girl was a rounding error. The rule of control dictated that he stay his hand to preserve the empire. The treaty was built on the assumption that they were professionals, Kaito said, his voice dropping an octave, vibrating with a newfound, lethal resonance. "But they have become scavengers. They are hunting in my backyard and paying the police with the change they steal from children." "It's $3, Kaito," Kenji whispered, leaning forward, his eyes wide. "The council will see this as a lapse in judgment. They'll say the dragon has grown soft, moved by a child's tears. You'll be fighting the Ruji in front of you and your own lieutenants behind you." Kaito finally turned, his sharp facial structure catching the dim light of the cabin. The dragon tattoos on his neck seemed to coil as his jaw tightened. He picked up the 3 crumpled bills and held them up. To any other man, it was the price of a coffee. To Kaito, it was the only honest money he had touched in a decade. It was a contract signed in the blood of his own repressed past, a debt to a sister he could no longer save, being paid forward to one he could. "The council values stability," Kaito replied, his expression becoming a mask of terrifying, icy resolve. "But they forget that I am the one who defines it. If the Ruji believe they can erase people in this district without a tax, then the treaty is already dead. I am not breaking the peace, Kenji. I am ending a plague." He tapped the glass partition, signaling the driver. The command was silent, but the intent was absolute. The period of non-interference was over. He wasn't just a businessman anymore. The Predator had found a moral compass, and it was pointing directly at the Ruji shipyards. "Call the Shadow Enforcers," Kaito commanded, his eyes reflecting the cold, hard green of the traffic lights ahead. "Tell them the dragon has accepted a new contract, and tell them to bring enough fire to burn a snake pit to the ground." The sky over the district didn't just break, it dissolved. A heavy, rhythmic deluge began to fall, turning the neon signage of the Ginza into bleeding smears of electric blue and violent violet. In the underworld, they would later call it the Night of Black Rain, not because of the weather, but because of the sheer volume of dark silk and cold steel that suddenly flooded the streets. Kaito Blackwood sat in the back of his moving sedan, his silhouette a jagged shadow against the flickering city lights. He wasn't just a man anymore. He was the eye of a hurricane that had been dormant for too long. Across the territory, the Shadow Enforcers received the signal. It wasn't a frantic call to arms, but a silent, digital pulse that bypassed the compromised frequencies of the 4th Precinct. In basement gyms, high-end cigar lounges, and nondescript tea houses, men who moved with the lethal grace of panthers set down their drinks and reached for their gear. These weren't street brawlers. They were Kaito's elite, tacticians who operated in the spaces between heartbeats. They checked the slides of suppressed submachine guns and tightened the straps of Kevlar vests hidden beneath tailored black overcoats. Kaito watched from the window as a motorcade of charcoal-gray SUVs began to form a silent spine behind his sedan. The coordination was terrifying in its precision. There were no sirens, no shouting, only the hiss of tires on wet asphalt and the low hum of high-performance engines. This was the mobilization of a private army, a kinetic force designed to dismantle a syndicate with the same surgical coldness Kaito applied to his ledgers. "The Ruji believe the rain hides their sins," Kaito murmured, his eyes reflecting the passing street lamps like polished obsidian. "They think the darkness is their ally because they were born in it. They forget that I own the shadows they hide in." The city seemed to hold its breath. Pedestrians, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, hurried into doorways, their instincts screaming that the rule of control had been traded for something far more primal. The air felt heavy with the scent of ozone and gun oil. Kaito felt a strange, jarring clarity. For years, he had been a diplomat of the dark, a man who negotiated with the rot to keep the structure standing. But as the motorcade veered toward the industrial skeleton of the shipyards, he felt the last of his hesitation wash away with the rain. He reached into his pocket and touched the $3. They were dry, protected from the storm, just as he intended to protect the girl who had given them to him. The Ruji Syndicate had spent years building a kingdom of fear, but they were about to learn that there is no predator more dangerous than one who has rediscovered his soul. As the first crane of the shipyard loomed out of the fog like a skeletal hand, Kaito didn't give an order for mercy. He simply nodded to the driver, and the night of black rain began in earnest. The shipyard was a labyrinth of rusted iron and salt-crusted shadows, illuminated only by the rhythmic, strobing light of the storm. The Ruji sentries never heard the shadow enforcers arrive. They only felt the sudden, terminal weight of suppressed rounds and the ghost-like presence of men who moved like smoke against the dark. Kaito stepped out of his vehicle, his black suit absorbing the dim light, and walked into the chaos with a terrifying, measured gait. He didn't take cover. He didn't run. He moved with the absolute certainty of a man who had already decided the outcome of the night. The silence of the docks shattered as the Ruji realized the scale of the invasion. Muzzle flashes erupted from the upper tiers of stacked shipping containers, carving jagged lines through the downpour. Kaito's men responded with tactical perfection, moving in three-man cells that dismantled the syndicate's defenses with surgical efficiency. Steel groaned as bullets chewed through the corrugated metal walls of the containers, and the air filled with the sharp, metallic tang of spent brass and the ozone of the storm. Kaito moved through the center of the fray, a calm specter amidst the carnage. When a Ruji soldier lunged from behind a stack of crates, his neck marked with the jagged red snake, Kaito didn't hesitate. His movement was a blur of practiced lethality, a parry, a strike to the throat, and a shove that sent the man into the Black Harbor water below. He wasn't fighting for territory or pride. He was clearing a path. Every step forward was a rejection of the rule of control that had allowed this den of vipers to exist. The battle moved deeper into the heart of the shipyard, a cinematic descent into a hell of steam and iron. High-intensity floodlights swung wildly overhead, catching the spray of the sea and the glint of Kaito's tattoos as he discarded his wet overcoat. He was a vision of controlled rage, a dragon unleashed in a cathedral of commerce. The Ruji fought with the desperation of cornered animals, but they were facing a force that had transcended business. Kaito's enforcers moved like a single organism, a black tide rising to meet the red snakes, turning the shipyard into a graveyard of broken treaties. Through the cacophony of gunfire and thunder, Kaito kept his eyes on the central warehouse, the place where the collateral damage was stored before being sold into the night. The rain-slicked docks were a gauntlet of fire and blood, but to Kaito, they were merely the threshold. He felt the $3 in his pocket, a small weight that felt heavier than the world, guiding him through the smoke. The siege was no longer about the city or the syndicate. It was about the door at the end of the pier and the innocent soul he had promised to bring back from the dark. The interior of the central warehouse was a cavern of suffocating stillness, smelling of stagnant salt and industrial grease. Kaito kicked open the final heavy door, his shadow stretching long and jagged across the concrete floor. In the corner, huddled on a rusted crate, was Aiko. She looked exactly like the graduation photo Hana had described, eyes wide with a terror that had gone past screaming into a hollow, haunting silence. Her hands were zip-tied, her spirit frayed, but she was alive. Between Kaito and the girl stood Ryuji himself. The man was a stark contrast to Kaito's polished lethality, sweaty, panicked, and clutching a gold-plated pistol with a trembling hand. He had the red snake tattooed crudely across his throat, a symbol of the rot Kaito had allowed to fester. Ryuji backed away toward a side exit, his eyes darting between the armed shadow enforcers filling the doorways and the silent, blood-splattered man who looked more like a vengeful god than a rival boss. "You're burning the whole city for a girl who doesn't even have a last name, Kaito?" Ryuji hissed, his voice cracking like dry wood. "Think about the treaties. Think about the Prophet. You kill me, and the 4th Precinct will tear your empire apart by sunrise. Step aside, and we can forget this happened. I'll even give you a cut of the next shipment." Kaito felt the cold weight of his own weapon in his hand. He could end the Ryuji syndicate with a single twitch of his finger. He could watch the light leave the eyes of the man who had turned his city into a hunting ground. Every instinct of the dragon screamed for an execution, a final, bloody punctuation mark to the night of black rain that would ensure no one ever dared to cross his borders again. But then he looked at Aiko. She wasn't watching the standoff. She was staring at Kaito with a look of pure, fragile hope, her small frame shivering in the damp air. If he pulled the trigger, he would remain a predator, a slightly more righteous one, perhaps, but a predator nonetheless. He would be teaching her that the only answer to darkness was more darkness. Kaito slowly lowered his gun, the metal clicking softly as he engaged the safety. The gesture was a profound betrayal of the underworld code, but a supreme victory for the man he was becoming. "You aren't worth the lead, Ryuji," Kaito said, his voice devoid of heat, yet heavy with a finality that felt like a death sentence. "The police who protected you are being rounded up as we speak. My men have already leaked your ledger to the Internal Affairs Division in the capital. You won't die tonight. You'll spend the rest of your life watching your empire vanish from behind a cage." He turned his back on the syndicate boss, an act of ultimate perceived weakness that was actually the ultimate display of power. He walked toward Aiko, his movements softening as he approached. He knelt in the grime, shielded her eyes from the carnage behind them, and sliced through her restraints with a small, sharp blade. "Your sister sent me," he whispered, the words feeling strange and light on his tongue. "The contract is fulfilled." The rain had slowed to a rhythmic, mournful drizzle by the time the black sedan pulled back onto the curb where the encounter had begun. The neon signs of the district were humming now, their electric glow reflecting off the oil-slicked asphalt in fractured rainbows. Hana was still there. She stood like a small, dark statue against the gray backdrop of the city, her simple black dress damp and clinging to her frame, her eyes never leaving the corner where Kaito's car had vanished hours ago. The door opened, and Kaito stepped out first. The contrast was jarring, a visual testament to the violence of the night. His tailored silk suit was ruined, darkened by seawater and stained with the crimson geometry of a battle fought in the shadows. The dragon on his neck seemed to pulse in the low light, a mark of the predator who had gone into the pit and returned. But as he turned to reach back into the car, the hardness in his silhouette softened. He stepped aside, and Aiko emerged. For a heartbeat, the street was silent, the hum of the city fading into the background. Then, a small, choked sound broke from Hana's throat. She didn't run at first. She stumbled, her light-colored flats splashing through a puddle as if she couldn't quite believe the vision before her. Aiko, weary and wrapped in a heavy wool coat Kaito had provided, met her halfway. The sisters collided in a desperate, silent embrace, their small frames shaking with the force of a grief finally being exhaled. Kaito watched them from the periphery, standing near the hood of his car like a sentinel. He was a man of blood and iron, a figure of terror to the rest of the city. Yet in this moment, he looked strangely out of place, a dark monument to a peace he had once thought impossible. The purity of their reunion, the softness of Hana's hair against Aiko's shoulder, was a world away from the cold, clinical ledgers he had spent his life balancing. Hana eventually looked up, her face tear-streaked but radiant under the flickering street lamps. She pulled away from her sister just enough to look at Kaito, her gaze dropping to his blood-spattered cuffs and then to his eyes. There was no fear in her expression anymore, only a profound, quiet recognition. She reached into the small pocket of her dress and pulled out a tiny, folded piece of paper, the receipt for a life saved. Kaito shook his head slowly. He reached into his own pocket and pulled out the 3 crumpled dollar bills she had given him. He didn't say a word as he took her small, cold hand and pressed the money back into her palm, closing her fingers over it. The contract was closed, but the debt he had owed to his own past was finally settled. As he watched the two sisters walk away into the fading mist of the Ginza, Kaito Blackwood realized that the $3 hadn't bought a hitman. They had bought back a piece of a man who had been missing for 30 years. The decades drifted over the city like the coastal fog, smoothing the jagged edges of a history written in neon and blood. The name Kaito Blackwood eventually transitioned from a whispered threat in the backrooms of Ginza to a legend of the old guard, a man who had dismantled his own empire of iron to build something far more enduring. He had disappeared from the ledgers and the street corners years ago, leaving behind a district that no longer looked away when the vulnerable cried out. He had traded the rule of control for a legacy of quiet guardianship, a shadow that didn't haunt the city, but shielded it. In a sun-drenched corner of a thriving floral boutique near the docks, the air smelled of lilies and rain instead of salt and industrial grease. Aiko, now a woman with the same steady grace her sister once possessed, moved between the displays with a practiced, gentle hand. She stopped for a moment to adjust a photograph on the wall, a picture of two sisters, years younger, standing on a rain-slicked sidewalk with a tall, shadowed man whose face was partially turned away from the camera. Beneath the photograph, resting on a velvet-lined shelf, sat a small, sealed glass case. Inside were 3 US dollar bills, their edges frayed and their surfaces creased from being folded with a child's desperate precision. To the customers who frequented the shop, it was a curious piece of art, perhaps a charm for good fortune. But to the sisters, it was the foundation of their lives. It was the physical proof that even in a world of predators and collateral damage, a single whisper could halt a dragon mid-flight. Hana often sat near that case in the quiet hours of the evening, her simple black dress long since replaced by the vibrant colors of a life lived in the light. She remembered the cold silk of Kaito's suit and the way his tattooed hand had felt as he pressed her money back into her palm. She knew that the $3 had never been about the currency. It had been a key that unlocked a door Kaito had spent 30 years bolting shut. Kaito Blackwood was gone, but his soul remained anchored to that glass case. He had died a man of peace, his legacy no longer etched in the scars of his enemies, but in the thriving shop, the laughter of the sisters, and the safety of a district that had learned to protect its own. The dragon had finally found what all the millions in his offshore accounts could never buy, a way to go home. As the sun set over the shipyard, casting long, golden shadows across the floor, the $3 caught the light, glowing like a promise kept in the dark.